So, hello everybody, good morning. Welcome to one more episode of FSI Insights, which I have the pleasure to host with Leonardo Meeus. And today, our FSI Insight actually is dedicated to an unusual topic for FSI. So we are not here to discuss energy regulation or reforms in Europe, but actually we are dedicating to a less important topic, which is the electricity sector reform in China. So we have the pleasure to have here two well-established professors, two Chinese professors and also a woman, which is a great pleasure, of course, for us, from two universities, one in Australia and actually another in UK. So they are actually in different time zones and bringing two different perspectives of this reform. So one from the political governance perspectives and another from engineering and economics. So it's a pleasure to have here Professor Xu, who said that she likes to be called from the first name. So who's a research professor in the Center of Governance and Public Policy in Griffith University in Australia. So Professor Xu, besides several years of careers and impressive number of publications, especially books that is on politics of nuclear energy in China, politics of state on grid corporation of China coming from Oxford, on authority, capacity and legitimacy of World International Organization, Oxford. So welcome and thank you, Professor Xu. You're your second keynote speaker. Is a Professor Furong Li. So Professor Li is a professor in the Department of Electronic and Electronical Engineer and Director of the Center of Sustainable Power Distribution at the University of Bath in UK. And Professor Li as well, many years of experience, brilliant public list, like a record of publication, working on power sector generation, transmission, distribution under planning operation prices. And in the last 5 years, more specifically, she has been working together with the British Embassy in China to share the experience that UK has had the reforms and transfer this experience to Chinese policymakers. So both Professor Li and Professor Xu have recorded our FSI Insights views, which you can find it in our FSI website. So they have the chance of speaking about the past and the future challenges of the reform. Both of them also highlight that the huge challenge of the China right now, it's the fact that China is still needing to increase its capacity of electricity. And at the same time now committed to the setting of the carbon peak by 2030, which was a commitment already signed by the government, and also moving to carbon neutrality by 2060. So besides our brilliant keynote speakers, thank you so much for accepting and to recording our videos before. So we have here, I'm acting as a host as Leonardo, which is also who's going to be act as Discussants. And beside the two of us, you have our two new research associates who are debuting in our FSI online events with these hard tasks of grilling our speakers. So we have Sofia, Nicolai, and Daniele Stampatori. Welcome to FSI and above all FSI Insights, Daniele and Sofia. And without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Sofia, who will start the questions and answers, and we can start it or indeed the debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lucila, for the introduction. So without further ado, the first question I wanted to ask to our speakers is actually a more general one in order to introduce the debate. So I wanted to ask, does China have a model for the electricity market design? Is there a reference model that China aspires to, for example, the US or Europe or Japan?
Who's going to answer that question?
Whoever,
as you prefer,
exactly. So the questions can be addressed to any of you, and you can answer. So,
yeah, if you wish, I could start with some of the thoughts. I think China is really big. They're very different with either States, Europe, UK, or Australia. And I think that they are fairly open-minded. I think especially you can see in the spot trials. I think 8 spot trials before, and it's extended to 6 more provinces. And you can see that in the spot trials, some provinces trial pool markets, some more bilateral markets, that also extending to ancillary services. So it's almost like China had so many different places. They are potentially not set stone into certain direction in terms of spot market. I think they are doing the right thing to testing different options to see market responses, see how market might operate, and what are the risks to power grid, what are the risks for power participants. But what emerged becomes certain is they are going to build integrated markets that have harmonized market rules across whole country. But we also understand that they haven't got much well-functioning spot markets at many places. So it's a harmonization of how the market might, how they say integrated, uniform markets might shape. That was also interesting to see. But I think the state released a document early this year and committed and made it clear, unified, integrated market design is what they are going for, because they have seen in Europe, we started with different countries, pursue different paths. When coming to stage when we need to integrating all this market together, and amount of energy and effort to harmonizing different market designs, operations, and also, the more details, for example, the market clearing time and network prices, network access, all different, but we are going to much more harmonized position, but that take us a very long time.
If I want to add anything, I probably should go back a little bit to history about it. It's not that China did not try, as I mentioned in the video. China started electricity reform long before everybody else. 1984, they decided to lower the entrance into the generation. They introduced the power producing PPA agreement. They introduced the independent power producers. 1997, they decided to try somehow have a market system in terms of electricity trading. None worked, but at the same time, things seem to improve. It's very difficult, for me at least, to see at the end of the day, China would adopt the market system as you would see in the US, for example, or in Europe, the wholesale, the retail, because the government policies are quite clear. They're going to have the combination of the government guardians plus market forces. So the government policies will always be in dominant position, and then the instrument will be the market measures to promote this. The market reform or establish some kind of a market system. So I cannot imagine there would be an independent operators at managing a particular market, whether you're talking about the provincial level, you're talking about regional level, it's just difficult for me to envision this. I think the country is not only large, there has been a very different history that makes things very, very difficult to change. Meanwhile, I think the government is quite open-minded of learning from all types of reforms from other countries. This has been going on for 40 years too. We're willing to listen, we're willing to learn, but we're going to have our own way of doing that. I think this is the key message the Chinese government has been sending out to the world.
If I can just come back, I think I'm possibly much more optimistic. I think 2020 marks the 20th anniversary of China's power sector reform. 2002, China started the first round of power market reform. But you can imagine 20 years ago, power engineer is the most sought after profession, quite by high salary, high perks, high social status. And very pleased this becomes a past. Nowadays, this highly qualified graduates had so many other places they are going for: finance, communication, private firm, and consultancies and startups. So I would not be very surprised if they would have an independent trading center. I think that China already had 2 national trading centers and 33 provincial trading centers. And how independent they are to the grid, I'm not very clear. But I can just see into the future that boundary between trading and dispatch centers would become clearer, and that is a government desire and also the need of the system.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for both answers. And perhaps you could, the idea is to switch between Sofia and Daniele. So I will give the floor to Daniele.
Thank you. Actually, my first question is not so strictly related to the electricity reform, but I think that it can help to understand the evolution of the sector. What I mean, basically nowadays, China is the global leading exporter of PV, wind, battery technologies. But on the other side, the European Union is one of the main importer of these technologies. But in order to reach its 2060 target, China will have to increase its internal demand of this technology. So my question is, what could be the impact on the related national industries and the impact on countries that nowadays rely on imports from China for renewable technologies? Thank you.
You want me to answer that question?
Go ahead, Professor Xu.
If you look at the data in terms of the new renewable capacities from the International Renewable Energy Agency, and you do a calculation of 2020, that particular year, just 1 year, additional renewable capacities added in China, it's more than the total renewable capacity in a number of regions. I can give you it's about a quarter of the existing total renewable capacity of Europe. It's larger than South America, larger than Africa, larger than Middle East. Just 1 year addition. So when you talk about technology, there are different things. If you talk about the wind and the solar, that because of the large installed capacity in China, the cost has gone down significantly. I think to me, it's unreasonable to put the tariffs on the solar panel from China or wind turbine from China if you want to expand your renewable capacity. This is a part of the debate in the US. Biden said we're going to create our own jobs, rely on own supply chains, but at the same time, the cost of the producing solar panel wind turbine in the US, it's way, way, way above the cost to produce in China. If you want to increase the capacity, you go with a cheaper input. So that's one type of innovation you're talking about. It's not the invention, it's the innovation in terms of producing things, a new way of producing things, a new way of managing things. Then there are other new technologies. I think 2022, this is the first year, State Grid just put in place, this is the very first one, the large tidal wave somewhere along the coast. On the one hand, you see a lot of innovation taking place. On the other hand, China remains very inefficient in terms of energy production and energy consumption. So this is the contradiction in China. You talk about the technology at the moment. I'm doing something on nuclear. I did the nuclear before. Recently, I decided to pick up again, simply because there is a great competition. It's a competition among great powers to produce advanced nuclear technology to meet this target, carbon target. Europe is still debating whether they should pick up nuclear or not. France said, yes, we're going to build it. The Netherlands said, we are going to build it. But that won't be the large scale water reactors as we have seen 1,000 megawatt and above. We're going to see a small modular reactors that meet a varieties of purposes. That is the real competition for the future energy. It's difficult to say who is going to win it, but whoever gets there first gets the market share.
If I could also add, I think you're right that China is powerhouse for renewable technology, solar, wind, energy storage. I would imagine in 5 years' time, China also become powerhouse there, because there are a range of policies and industrial practice, not only incentivizing its development, but also deployment. Economies of scale is very much how much you deploy and how you utilize it. For example, currently energy storage, I think in terms of what a renewable generator do or what policy do to increasing renewable generator to deploy energy storage is government placing a incentive and that pass over to system operator or the grid company. So if for any renewable developer, if they could invest 15% of a storage capacity, then they would have a priority connection. So in this, you can imagine that you can encourage deployment of energy storage without significant government subsidies. So I can say there are a lot of new innovations of how you can encourage the growth of energy storage. And again, as you might see, the government just released a new policy document in February about energy storage development and deployment. Really see a significant step up in China to see how the new technology, how the country encourage new technology development, and they could see how energy storage at consumers and might be further sort of expanded and utilized, including data center, motorways, 5G. And in terms of network operator, I think in the past, network operator was encouraged to install energy storage. And you can see rapid growth in energy storage by state grid and southern power grid. And that since stopped that that practice, storage becomes a separate entity. And then you can see storage deployment in China had slowed down. So the new policy began to say that we possibly need to reintroducing this initiative. So for network operators can also invest in great scale energy storage in order to cope with intermittency in addition to interconnectors.
Fantastic.
Can I just add one point on this?
Of course.
Because of the question asked, I think, again, I tend to look at a relatively long period rather than what's going on today or yesterday. This goes back to the beginning of 2000. It's about the 2004, 2005. It's the central government's, it's conscious decision to combine the energy development with upgrading industrial capacity. So later, by the time the rest of the world heard about the Made in China 2025, that had already been going on for more than a decade. So the energy development, whether we're talking about renewables, we're talking about CCS, we're talking about electrical vehicles, none of this was independent. It's one piece of the whole big puzzle. But the general guideline is saying we want to change our energy structure. We need to improve or at least expand the renewable energies. But at the same time, the country needs to change the economic structure as a whole. That means you need to innovate. So these two happened and converged into this innovation.
Perfect. I think before going to the second round of questions, one important message to our audience is that actually you are already including your questions in questions and answers or in the chat, because you will collect them and you have started to pick the questions and address it in the half of the session. But now we will still have time to go to another round of questions with Sofia and Daniele. Perhaps Sofia can ask her third question.
Yeah, sure. So my second question actually relates to Daniele's one, because I wanted to ask you, how is it possible to reconcile carbon neutrality objective, China's carbon neutrality objective by 2060, with the ongoing construction of coal-fired power plants? So do you think you will rely massively, for example, on carbon capture and storage? Or do you think that these assets could actually become stranded assets in order to achieve this objective?
Very good question.
Would you like?
As I mentioned, I said a very good question. I don't think anybody has any ideas. I think the government set a target. The government set aims, and they put incentives and the sticks. The both carrot and the sticks have been put in place. They encourage the firms, state-owned as well as private, to use that incentives to achieve that objective. How? I don't know. I don't think anyone has any idea. Government is saying, we put this carbon tax, that's the stick. We also put subsidies to encourage people to develop renewables. Meanwhile, it's not that China is still building huge amount of thermal capacity, but the existing thermal capacity already built in China, that's about 50% of the global thermal capacity. How are you going to manage that?
I think it's worthwhile to emphasizing energy security, supply security are paramount important in China. I think that the biggest risk for any provincial or national system operator is blackout in either large or small. And I'm very pleased to see that rarely have a large rarely or haven't really heard very large scale blackout in China. So it's just showing they do have a great technical capability. And it's also worthwhile to mention the current energy mix. Coal still had a 61% as end of 2020. Renewables only makes up 10% of total energy mix. Hydro 17%, nuclear 5%. So as they project into 2030 and 2050, by 2030, they expecting nuclear power would increase from 5% to 7%. Renewables increase from 10% to 22%. And the coal-fired power station dropped from 61% to 42%. I think China is very pragmatic, understanding this directional travel, but we cannot reach there at one step. Therefore, I think that aiming for 42, and you know China, that they tend to exceed in their planned goals. So I think I have every single confidence they might reach there a bit earlier than 2030. And by 2050, what the expected energy capacity and energy mix for coal would drop down to 9%, when nuclear increased up to 16%, and the renewable energy would go up to 58%. And so I think that, as I also said in my other recorded message, by 2030, energy demand would also increase from a current 7,050 terawatt-hour to 11,800 terawatt-hour by 2030. That's a significant increase. But what China expecting is a large part of 77% of this demand increase will be entirely met by new renewable capacity development. Therefore, you would see the total installed capacity by 2030 would be 4,000 gigawatts. It's really because renewables had a much lower load factor. So I can see that they also planning for 2050 had great nuclear power, and also I think there are significant new demand for hydrogen. So I think they are keep option open, although renewable development would still be the key development. But 2050 is a long time ago, and I'm very much hoping there are much better technologies comes in and can stir up things. Because in Victoria time, I remember I read the history of electricity supply in the UK. In Victoria time, the fuel they use is entirely coal, and pollution is so bad. So their low carbon future is gas power plant, but gas for heating. That is their low carbon future. And they never really see nuclear with the horizon. So I would really hoping in over next 30 to 40 years, we can really see a new technology comes in that might transform our future energy mix.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Can I just add one point? I think people, again, I keep coming back to history. That's remind me, recently I read this is Cicero's Imperium. Cicero said if people don't take history into consideration, they only know what from the time of their birth, they remain to be children. Anyway, so we need to look at a relatively long period of time. Europe as a whole reached energy peak around 1990. So if you think 1990 to 2030, so this gave you the 40 years period to do the transition. North America reached energy peak around 2000. China will not reach the peak until 2030. So they got a very, very short, half of the time to do the transition. So everything has to be taken into consideration in that short time frame. It is the problem with the current thermal. It's not only because China wants the energy security, want the electricity reliable, they still need the basic supply. Simply thermal at the moment do not run as they're supposed to run. So if you look at the utilization rate of most thermal power plants, it's quite low in comparison with other countries. So energy efficiency, it's a big problem. At the same time, it's very difficult to close down inefficient thermal power plant. This is all of you about the local politics. That's about the jobs. That's about the livelihood. You cannot just say, I'm going to close those power plants. What you're going to do with local development. So those are the politics. It's the political reality. So it's not the central government saying, because we want to reach carbon neutrality by 2060, we can just close down all the thermal power plants. Mm-hmm. So what they try to do to use incentive to expand the renewables. Hopefully, from now on, you get 80% each year additional capacity come from renewables rather than from thermal.
I think that if I can add on, I think this recent policy release from government energy storage development and deployment might really make a huge difference. And that's especially on the consumer side, they really encourage new technology deployed, utilized, and connected in order to counter for interconnection. And that area is really closely related with the users, closely related with the communities. And we can imagine the government might also see the alignment with the 5G and that China not lack short of clever, intelligent, hardworking people. And if demand side could be mobilized through this policy development, and I could see that potentially renewable integration could be far greater and earlier than we would foresee for 2060. Would be nice if we can see that carbon neutrality could be reached in 2050 in line with the UK and Europe.
Very interesting points. Indeed, it's I think it's challenging to think in a market so different than EU, in which the capacity peak, it was in different time. It still needed to grow, and at the same time needs to comply with the climate change commitments that our governments are taking it. But I still think that we have one more time, I don't know, complete round, but at least half a round. So Sofia, can you go to, Daniele can go to your, yes, sure. Daniele, exactly, sorry.
Don't worry. Thanks. My second question is about energy saving. Currently in Europe, we are facing a sharp increase in energy price, and energy saving is seen as one of the main solutions in order to alleviate the problem. If I'm not wrong, China is promoting household energy saving, introducing price in electricity price that increase in household according to consume. So more you consume, more you pay the same kilowatt hour. So my question is, if in your opinion, this mechanism could be could favor wealthier people that, for example, live in a smaller family or spend all the day not at home. And my second point is if in a perspective of a liberalized market, the government is planning to introduce a safeguard mechanism for vulnerable consumers. Thanks.
Can I answer this question first?
Yes, please.
It's not really about the consumer or the residential consumption. What I want to emphasize, what I want to pay attention is the main energy consumers. It's the industries. China has a lot of energy intensive industries. In that sense, China is a virtual energy exporter. So if you look at the steel, this is all the low level, the steel, aluminum, flat glass, cement. These are very energy intensive industries. So when you talk about the consumption, the industries are the largest consumer of energy. This is a serious challenge the government has to somehow manage. What China wants at the moment, I think a manufacturing industry in terms of value added. China I think manufacturing contributes to 28.6% of a GDP in comparison with, for example, in Australia, it's less than 6%. China wants to keep the manufacturing industries, but at the same time, they need to somehow reduce the energy consumption, makes energy more efficient in the manufacturing industries. So this is not about residential consumptions. I think there's the bulk of energy is consumed by the industries. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't answer your question. Because
okay.
Yeah, I come back to the consumer side. I think that in China, I think all customers are considered as vulnerable customers because price stability is the key. So although domestic consumers are at the very edge of the system, they should pay highest price compared with the industrial customer. I think many industrial customers, they connected to much higher voltage level. So in the countries like UK, Europe, industrial customers per unit cost in the same area tend to be much lower than China. But China, if you look at the past 20 years, price stays very stable. And that price tends to be relatively cheaper compared with the industry. But not so sure when that price protection would be lifted up, but I would imagine if you have a major energy storage, when consumers can hedge at major price volatility, I would imagine that would be the time the government may lift a bit of a protection. But what is encouraging to see is China lifted protection to heavy polluters. So that is one way they would penalizing industries that have poor energy efficiencies. So I think in terms of energy prices, wholesale energy price volatility, when you transfer it into end users for industry with low efficiency, I think that they can deviate 20% from the nominal sort of market safe place. But for other customers, that band would be closer, i.e., the regulated price for customers. You can only you only allow market to influence within 10% is nominal set prices. But if you are heavy industrial polluter, then the protection that would go wider. or unprotected would go wider to 20%. So I think that China is cautious, but they are gradually opening up.
You're muted, Lucila.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sofia. And thank you for the answers. Indeed, very interesting. I think might be the case that Leo has a follow-up question. I think now you're muted.
Yeah.
Yes.
With pleasure. I was following. It's a very interesting discussion. I'm learning a lot.
Yeah.
So maybe I start with a clarification question, because Xu also already in her video talked about what she called regulated prices, even a catalog of prices, right? So how does that work? So you have a wholesale price. I mean, Furong already replied to one of the Q&A questions that there is spot trading going on. 30-something% of consumption is traded spot. So who is then buying wholesale, but then selling it at regulated retail prices? So subsidized retail prices. Is that then some entity that is forced to buy at higher prices than they're allowed to charge to the consumers, or how does that work?
Go on. I think they're asking.
Should I talk about the cataloging price at first, then you talk about the recent development? Historically, this is what I said, it's difficult for people to talk about market system in China as if you're talking about the market system elsewhere, because you cannot have government decided the prices in order for the market to work. But historically, price has always been decided by the government. But there's a cataloging system. It's the cataloging them in terms of the usage. Who is using it? Industry, agriculture, residential, or commercial. They also categorize in terms of the producers, from the large power plant to small power plant. It's a hydro, it's a thermal, it's a different kind. And which part of the region are you talking about? So the price increase, it's managed. It's not decided by seller or buyer. So that's why the concept of a market, it's different. And particularly the electricity price, because a large proportion of electricity comes from thermal power plant. So you get two different prices. The coal price was freed or liberalized in the early 1990s, but electricity price has been controlled by the government. So you always have the competition between the struggle, the fight between the two. Used to be the case. Every year, the major producers of coal, major producer of electricity, they sit at a table and they negotiate a price according to the general principle set by the central government. That's the NDRC. So until today, the government to try to say, let the market decide, but they are unwilling to let the market decide, simply because electricity is the input to industry as well as people's life. I don't get into politics of that. Anyway, that's my answer to it.
Leonardo, it's a very good question. I think currently the prices, like Wild West, how they forming prices at different markets, they tend to have a fairly diverse range. To be honest, I think I already have a tiny bit of understanding of the complexity currently. And I would also need to clarify my answers for Claire's question, order of magnitude of electricity being traded. Sorry, it's I didn't realize it's a spot market. I think that currently traded volume is for 33% of the total, but spot market, I think it's almost nothing. So the trading, I think currently you can engage national trading, inter-regional, inter-provincial trading, and you can employ a very different approach. And some trading, they trading entirely for price, but entire quantity, but not price. Some it's quantity plus price, and quite often this traded volume doesn't have a load profile. So how to decouple this quantity into different time frames, it's very challenging. So I would emphasize in current trading volume, it's really largely forward market, not spot market, and there are very different ways of trading. And even for ancillary services, I think they sometimes don't like market fighting price. They actually have some kind of sharing arrangements. For example, in Northwest, you have 5 provinces belong to Northwest regional power grid. So they have some kind of peak power sharing arrangement. If Gansu had too much renewable energy, they would shifting over to Shanxi, and Shanxi had dominant coal, so Shanxi would provide coal generation to help Gansu to meet peak demand. So they do have some sort of arrangement, but over the hand, not market-based. Sometimes you wonder if at certain times that might offer efficiencies over the traditional entirely market-based approach. But I would like to see some sort of potentially hybrid approach. I can see that in the UK, especially for ancillary services, we introduced the 20-odd market for frequency responses, some for large conventional power plants, some for battery storage. And so the network operator got to allocating certain volume responses to different needs. I think it's a fairly complicated process. While some of the practice used in China, such as the Southern Power Grid, and they very much contract frequency responses and pay off each participant according to the volume and the speed of the responses. And so I think between the complexity and accuracy, I think there possibly be some sort of balance we need to strike. But again, at price forming, it is really the most important element in power sector reform. And it's got to be key objectives. And all the other development is try to supporting this price forming mechanisms. So when market participants responding, they would lead to much better utilization of renewable, lead to increase supply security and resilience. If you don't forming that market right, then you might see all sorts of different unintended consequences.
Can I just again add one sentence? Trading, it's not taking place always in the market. You can have a barter system. That's not a market per se. So electricity trading in China at the moment has a very little resemblance as what you see in the electricity market in Europe, in North America. Because the price is the key. Price, it's managed. So if you go back to 2015, 2016, central government decided we need to open up the services part, retailing part. What they did do saying state grid, you could not charge that much in terms of the wholesale. But in fact, it's the simple word sale is not decided on the market. So state grid took a 10% cut in terms of what it's supposed to get. The general idea is it's a price, it's managed. It's managed by a government bureaucracies. But the government cannot, and it's unwilling to let it go because it has too widespread impact.
I think also come back to Leonardo's question, who's managing offer subsidies to end consumers. I think the large bulk of the energy is produced by generation company, bought by grid company. They are responsible for both delivery, transmission and final supply. So you can imagine this big bulk of energy transportation and have mixed transmission distribution network. So you can do a lot of cross subsidies. And also that against this bigger background, they also introducing independent suppliers. Some are affiliated with state grid, some are independent. So they do encourage more independent suppliers comes into play. And one final remark I would like to make, I think although the market arrangement is not rule-based, not well-functioning at present, but you do see the will from the people, from the stakeholder, reform stakeholder and the policymakers. They need to reform, but how to reform, I think they are trying different ways and allow various options to be explored. So initially, for outsiders, it's not market. It seems very rudimentary. But I think that one thing it does is it's create interests. So if you do something different, people can see the benefit to themselves, to the supply industry, to low carbon decarbonization. And over time, I think when you have enough people have interest, have a knowledge, have the confidence to play, and then that is a time to go over to well-functioning power markets. And that is part of report we written for British Embassy in Beijing with a group of UK experts. And so we set a roadmap for introducing power markets into 3 stages. 2020, 2025, they put down key foundation for various power markets and the key components. Between 2025 to 2030, it's joined dots and began to forming well-functioning power markets. And then from 2030 to 2060, when the system is in place, then you can exercise deep decarbonization.
Great, thank you for clarifying, and I fully agree with Nicolai's comment that basically, so we've probably more experience with these spot market arrangements, but then China is maybe some inspiration for Europe in the current crisis where we are looking into maybe going towards more long-term arrangements, right, to deal with the crisis. Then we can have a look at how you've handled that in China. Maybe I'll just use the last minutes to ask a question that also fascinated me. There was not too long ago, I think, representatives sometimes of State Grid China came to Europe and presented these very ambitious projects to interconnect China, beyond China, right? Furong,
global energy interconnection.
Yeah, exactly. Furong in her video was already saying that there is a lot of transmission to be invested within China, to bring renewables from the west to the east where the consumption is. But then there has also been this ambition to interconnect China. So what are the latest developments on that issue? Would be nice to know.
This is a part of the last chapter of my book about this global energy interconnection. If you talk to the former Secretary of Energy in the US, Stephen Chu, and he really highly praised this high voltage transmission networks because that allows the renewables from far away to be integrated into the system. And that's great, the technology innovation. It's a high cost. Anyway, doesn't really matter what's going on. And based on the development of the high voltage DC as well as AC networks, the state grid started pushing for the global energy interconnection. The idea is if different parts of the world can be connected through DC, AC, high voltage, and you can, because of the different time zones, utilize the wind and the solar much more efficiently. And then you do not need the same kind of backup capacity as the base supplies. That was the initial ideas. So they set up this global energy interconnection development corporation, whatever. By the time it just want support from the UN Sustainable Development Goal and part of other UN agencies, then China started getting problem with the US. So this became a political issue. How dare you allow the Chinese companies to build this cross-country interconnected transmission network and make it vulnerable to security, the cyber attack, and blah, blah. So anyway, now it becomes a highly political issue across countries.
Mm. Just add a bit from my side. I think that as we all know, China experienced a major renewable curtailment, especially in Northwest, North, and Northeast. They are where the generation, clean generation potential resides. Much of demand in South and Southeast. And with a further intense renewable development, we can see that distance, I think renewable energy development is further pushed towards North and West, Southwest and Northeast. So the transfer capability requirements would increase even further. And it's worthwhile, I got some bit of document from our Chinese colleagues to say that in 2020, the required surplus generation capacity in the 3 North, i.e. Northwest, Northeast, exceeding 400 gigawatts, but the present transfer capability is only 78 gigawatts. So this is our current position. The requirement is more than 4 times than the current capability. And this renewable penetration is still in 11%. So you can imagine that China needs a major development in interconnector, allow renewable energy transfer to the load center over significant distance. Externally exporting to other country, I suppose that China has extra high voltage technology either for AC and DC, and for that end, I'm not entirely sure the current development, but I understand that people had a different perception for why China developed this interconnection with other countries. One is saying that it's much easier for China to access more energy from neighborhoods. The other people say, another view is that China is key to export energy from China to outside the world. So you can imagine that there are diverse views why China developed this. But I hope this development is for the good of global renewable development, clean energy transition, and achieving carbon neutrality much sooner for the whole world.
By the way, the idea did not come from China. The idea came from Nordic countries.
Yes, absolutely.
And the Americans keep saying if we had a similar connections as Europeans, and Texas would not have that blackout, which is true. In US, just 3 separate grids create a lot of problems and a lot of waste in terms of energy. But building cross-country connection, it's political, it's problematic.
And also that I would like to say that Michael Pollitt starting this China engagement much earlier than I did. And he wrote a series of papers on this different aspect of China power sector reform. And he also had one book comprehensively cover power sector reform issues from all different perspectives. So I think that's called reforming the Chinese Chinese electricity sector. So that's a good book to follow. And hopefully that our report for British Embassy in Beijing could also be released at some point into the future. And that is a roadmap to well-functioning Chinese power market.
Fantastic. Very interesting. Thank you so much. Indeed, I think the whole debate was for me very bright and very clarified for those who doesn't know the Chinese market. Leonardo, do you want to close the event?
No, just like you, I learned a lot, and I just want to thank also both Professor Xu and Furong Li to join us and to explain, and Sofia and Daniele, the newest researchers in our team. They asked very nice questions, so it was very interesting.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's nice to talk to people who can understand.
So we have the recording has been stopped right now, yeah. And indeed it was a pleasure to listen from you both, and to have 2 very well-established legal scholars. It was, I think, a pleasure. This is what you wanted from FSI Insights, the Leonardo and I, to take the keynote speakers, as you call, in the field. So thank you.
Thanks for inviting. I think I had good time. I thought my knowledge is so limited, but nice it's actually online, so I can search some information whilst we are in session.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for organizing, and Leonardo, thanks for invite again. And yeah, it's very good. Nice meeting you, Professor Yi-chong. I think hopefully we can keep in touch.